In preparation for the 2008 national elections, the U.S. bishops issued Faithful Citizenship 2007. In this document, of course, they link health care to other social justice issues and to the preferential option. Here is a brief quotation. Affordable and accessible health care is an essential safeguard of human life and a fundamental human right. With an estimated 47 million Americans lacking health coverage, it is also an urgent national priority. Reform of the nation's healthcare system needs to be rooted in values that respect human dignity, protect human life, and meet the needs of the poor and uninsured, especially born and unborn children, pregnant women, immigrants, and other vulnerable populations. What stands out in this brief quotation? First, health care is a national priority for all of us, regardless of party affiliation. Secondly, deserving of special regard are born and unborn children and pregnant women. This represents Catholicism's pro-life values. But thirdly, and equally important, are the poor, immigrants, and vulnerable populations. We could note that there is no distinction made between legal and illegal immigrants, the poor, immigrants, and vulnerable populations. And I think here we should think particularly, too, of African Americans. And fourth, this nuance that we should think of the poor and the vulnerable does reflect the general criterion of the preferential option for the poor. The bishops then continue, while the common good embraces all, those who are weak, vulnerable, and most in need deserve preferential concern. A basic moral test for our society is how we treat the vulnerable in our midst. We will be judged by our response to the least among us. The right to life implies and is linked to other human rights, to the basic goods that every human person needs to live and thrive. All the life issues are connected. The moral imperative to respond to the needs of our neighbors, basic needs such as food, shelter, health care, education, and meaningful work, is universally binding on our consciences. The issues are all interconnected, say the bishops, reflecting Cardinal Joseph Bernardine's concern for a consistent ethic of life. Yet, on the one hand, not all issues are the same. Killing the innocent does get special attention. Still, on the other hand, distinctions among different issues, say the bishops, cannot be an excuse for dismissing or ignoring other serious threats to human life and dignity. Racism and other unjust discrimination, and I am quoting them directly, the use of the death penalty, resorting to unjust war, the use of torture, war crimes, the failure to respond to those who are suffering from hunger, or a lack of health care, or an unjust immigration policy are all serious moral issues that challenge our consciences and require us to act. These are not optional concerns which can be dismissed. The bishops cite John Paul II and John the 23rd, as well as the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in support of these positions. 10 years ago, John Paul II called Catholics to take an active role in urging governments at home and abroad as well to commit themselves, and this is a quote, to drawing up effective legal guarantees to ensure that the health of those who do not have a voice will also be promoted in its entirety, and that the world of healthcare will be imbued with the logic of solidarity and charity rather than with the dynamics of profit. This applies both in the U.S. and internationally. So now let me just make a few remarks about justice and global health. We really don't have time, obviously, for a full treatment of all these issues, but I just want to keep this on the radar screen. Globally, by far the majority of people lack what most Americans would consider the essentials of a healthy life. Half the people in the world, which is nearly 3 billion, live on less than $2 a day. 20% of the population in the developed nations consumes 86% of the world's goods. And by contrast, about 790 million people in the developing world are chronically undernourished. Some 1.1 billion people in developing countries have inadequate access even to water, and 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. This is a huge cause of disease and death, especially the deaths of young children. Close to half of all people in developing countries are suffering at any given time from a health problem created by water and sanitation deficits. According to UNICEF, 30,000 children die each day due to poverty, including 1.8 million a year from diarrhea. This week in Congress, in fact, the House Committee on Foreign Relations is considering a Democrat-sponsored bill that would expand U.S. global health programs. For example, the U.S. AIDS program, PEPFAR, cares for 20,000 orphans annually in Haiti. And U.S. money for the Global Fund provides food rations for 50,000 AIDS-affected families in Haiti. But opponents of this bill want to freeze spending levels for 5 years and even retrench on the nutrition programs. They also would choose to revoke funding for family planning services for women, HIV-positive women, in AIDS treatment programs, even though those services are not to include abortion. A Jesuit priest, who I am proud to say also has his PhD from Boston College, named Terry Charlton, who is working in the slum of Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya, wrote this in an email letter to several people about this same bill. Working in Kenya, I see people suffering and dying all too often from a disease that can be prevented. It is crucial that this program not become a political football, and I hope members of Congress of goodwill from both sides of the aisle can find a way to work together for the sake of Africa. Unless the U.S. AIDS program goes forward, together with programs that address the broader context of the epidemic, the ones who suffer the most will be the children I work with every day. In the developing world, it would take about $9 billion in additional funds to provide water and sanitation for all. It would take $12 billion to provide women with medical care in relation to pregnancy and childbearing, and $13 billion to cover basic health and nutrition. That may sound like a lot, but think about this. Europeans spend $11 billion a year for ice cream. Americans spend $8 billion a year for cosmetics. The U.S. and Europe combined spend $12 billion for perfume. We spend $17 billion for pet food. And world military spending has risen to an incredible $780 billion. These are important voter issues. Last October, the Vatican nuncio to the United Nations, Archbishop Celestino Migliore, attacked the funneling of resources to military spending rather than providing basic health unity seems to on the need to ensure the right to basic health care for all. He pointed out that almost 10 million children under the age of 5 die every year, quote, mostly from preventable causes. Too many mothers, he continued, die in childbirth from preventable and treatable complications. Last year, 2.9 million people died of HIV/AIDS-related causes, and half the developing world lacks even basic sanitation. Meanwhile, nations spend more than $1 trillion a year on the military, he said, and as children die and generations lack even the basic necessities of life, we have continued to drift toward mutual and global destruction. In sum, health care is a global responsibility as well as a national priority. Global health care reform should be on our voting agenda for 2008. This is the message we should draw from Archbishop Migliore's UN speech. Now, the next section of my paper is on additional theological resources, but I just want to pause for 1 second here because I've been presenting Catholic social teaching as the answer to all of these problems, and I think it's a wonderful resource. But it's also important to note some of its limits. Again, we can't discuss these in detail, but these need to be in our consciousness. The first is that Catholic social teaching tends to approach social problems on a top-down model. So we have Archbishop Migliore going to the UN, for instance, or Bush meeting with John Paul II about the stem cell policy. And something that I think Catholic organizations like Catholic Relief Services, or here in the United States, the Catholic Health Association and local communities, something that we're also trying to do is work from the bottom up. To empower people to express and act on their own health needs. It is true that those of us with education, money, and power need to be catalysts in that process, but eventually ownership should not be only top-down, but also mid-level and grassroots. Okay, so that's one thing. A second thing that we're all aware of is that there is often an ambivalence on the issue of gender. So working for the poor, empowering the poor is great, but sometimes women's voice, women's needs take a back seat, particularly when pro-life issues are on the table. And I do not believe that those need to be mutually exclusive. And that is why I quoted Archbishop Migliore, who advocated for women and for prenatal, pregnancy, and maternal care. As well as care for children and the unborn. So I would just advocate that our voice on behalf of women needs to be equally loud, clear, and strong, and that will give us additional credibility. And the final thing, even reading my own remarks this morning, I was struck by how often the Catholic documents and Catholic, proponents talk about, healthcare cannot just be a commodity and we must not succumb to the dynamics of the market. And all of that is true, but our tradition has kind of an ambivalent and sometimes, not careful enough examination of, what is the market and when can it be used well as poorly. As we're looking at healthcare reform in our country today, obviously the market's going to have a role in that for a long time, and not just as a fact, but can it ever have in some way a positive role? So I think an issue here is how to bring the market under moral constraints, because doing away with it entirely is not possible and maybe not even desirable. And as Catholics, we tend often to argue just on two sides. The market's great and it has a solution to all of our problems, or, the market is a great source of abuse, sin, and oppression of the poor, and we don't really know what the other option is. So to talk across those issues, to come together and to think more carefully about market dynamics and how they can fit into healthcare reform is a task for the future.